The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I drove down the narrow path that led to my grandfather's cabin. It had been years since I had visited this place, and the familiar scent of pine trees and lake water brought tears to my eyes as I parked beside the weathered wooden structure. My grandfather had passed away 3 weeks ago, and according to his will, this lakeside cabin now belonged to me. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood summers, a modest two-bedroom structure with a wide porch facing the water. The wooden exterior had darkened with age, and some of the window frames needed repair, but it stood solid against the backdrop of towering pines and crystal blue water. The key felt heavy in my hand as I approached the front door. Emotions washed over me as I remembered my grandfather teaching me to fish off the dock, telling stories by the fireplace, and showing me how to identify different bird calls at dawn. This place had been his sanctuary for over 50 years, and now it was mine. The door creaked open, revealing an interior frozen in time. Fishing rods still leaned in the corner by the door. Faded photographs lined the pine walls, capturing decades of family memories. A thin layer of dust covered every surface, evidence that no one had been here since my grandfather fell ill last winter. I moved through the main room, running my fingers over the familiar furniture. The old plaid couch where I used to nap, the stone fireplace where we roasted marshmallows on rainy evenings, the handmade dining table where we played endless card games. Everything felt smaller than in my memories, yet exactly the same. On the kitchen table sat a stack of papers held down by an old fishing weight, legal documents, property deeds, and handwritten notes. I assumed they were related to the transfer of ownership, but there seemed to be far more paperwork than necessary for a simple cabin inheritance. I made a mental note to review them later. As the afternoon light shifted, I walked to the large window overlooking the lake. That was when I noticed something that definitely had changed. Across the water, where there used to be only forest, now stood a development of large, modern homes with manicured lawns reaching down to the shoreline. Their uniform design and pristine appearance created a stark contrast to my grandfather's rustic cabin. I decided to take a walk along the lakeshore before unpacking. The path followed the water's edge, eventually leading toward the new development. As I approached the area where the properties met, I noticed two women in tennis outfits standing at the end of a dock. They glanced in my direction, then whispered to each other, their faces showing clear disapproval. "Good afternoon," I called out with a friendly wave. They nodded curtly before turning away, continuing their conversation in hushed tones. Their body language made it clear I was not welcome in their space. Confused by their coldness, I continued my walk, noticing more residents watching me with similar expressions from their decks and yards. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting over the lake, casting golden light across the water. I stood on my grandfather's old dock, watching the reflection dance on the gentle waves. The modern houses across the lake glowed with bright interior lights, looking like something from a luxury real estate magazine. I decided then that I would spend the next few weeks here, fixing up the cabin and processing my grief. This place represented a connection to my grandfather that I was not ready to let go. Little did I know that this peaceful evening was the last truly quiet moment I would experience before the storm of conflict that was brewing just across the lake. The next morning, I woke with the sunrise and immediately started working on the cabin. Grandfather had kept the place structurally sound, but years of minimal maintenance had left plenty of small repairs needed. I started by fixing the loose boards on the porch, the rhythmic sound of hammering echoing across the quiet lake. By midday, I had cleared away cobwebs from the eaves and was repairing a section of railing when I noticed someone approaching from the direction of the development. A woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer casual wear walked with purpose down the shoreline path toward my property. "Hello there," she called out with a wide smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am Patricia Winters, Vice President of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. We noticed someone had moved into the old Martin place." I put down my hammer and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you. I am James Martin's grandson. He passed away recently and I inherited the cabin." Patricia's smile tightened slightly. How lovely that you are visiting. We were all quite fond of old Mr. Martin, though we rarely saw him in recent years. She glanced around at the cabin with poorly disguised judgment. I should mention that our community has certain standards that help maintain our property values. While your grandfather was grandfathered in, so to speak, any new ownership or renovations would need to comply with our architectural guidelines. I frowned, confused by her presumption. I am not aware of any agreements my grandfather had with your development. Oh, the whole lake area falls under our HOA jurisdiction now, she said, with a dismissive wave. I will have someone drop off our community guidelines so you can familiarize yourself with them during your stay. We are quite strict about maintaining the luxury aesthetic of our lakefront properties. Before I could respond, she was already turning to leave. Welcome to Lakeside Estates. Do stop by our community center if you need anything. 2 days later, I found an envelope stuck in my door frame. Inside was a glossy booklet titled Lakeside Estates Community Standards and Guidelines, with several passages highlighted in bright yellow. The highlighted sections included rules about exterior paint colors, landscaping requirements, and something called non-conforming structures remediation. That afternoon, I met Albert, an elderly man who owned one of the few remaining original properties further down the shore. He was walking his dog when he stopped to compliment my repair work. I see Patricia already made her welcome visit, he chuckled when I mentioned the guidelines booklet. Been dealing with them for years myself. That HOA runs this place like a corporate dictatorship since the development went in 10 years ago. Do they actually have any authority over properties like ours? I asked. Albert shrugged. They like to think so. They have been trying to push out all the original homeowners for years. Their president, Richard Harrington, is particularly aggressive about it. Former real estate developer with political ambitions, made his fortune building exclusive communities like this one. They never invited my grandfather to any meetings, I said. Not surprising. They prefer we did not know what they are planning. If you ask me, they are hoping all us old-timers will eventually sell or die off so they can bulldoze our places and build more of those cookie-cutter mansions. After Albert left, I spent the evening reviewing the HOA documents. I discovered troubling language about pre-existing structures being required to conform to community standards within reasonable timeframes following ownership transfers. According to their bylaws, my grandfather's death and my inheritance constituted such a transfer. The next morning, I was staining the repaired porch railings when a black Range Rover pulled up at the edge of my property. A tall man in his 60s, wearing crisp khakis and a polo shirt, stepped out and surveyed the cabin with visible distaste. Mr. Martin, Richard Harrington, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. He did not offer to shake hands, instead clasping them behind his back as he looked around. I understand Patricia provided you with our community guidelines. She did, though I am not sure they apply to my property, I replied, standing up to face him. Harrington's expression hardened. Let me be direct. This cabin, while charming in its own rustic way, is not compatible with our luxury community aesthetic. It significantly impacts the property values of the homes across the lake. This cabin has been here for over 50 years, I stated firmly, long before your development existed. Yes, and perhaps it served its purpose in a different era, but Lakeside Estates represents a 21st century vision for this area. Progress must be accommodated. He gestured toward the cabin. We would be happy to put you in touch with developers who might make you a reasonable offer for this lot. The land itself has considerable value, even if the structure does not. I felt my jaw tighten. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harrington, but I have no intention of selling. This property has been in my family for generations. I see, his tone grew colder. Then I would strongly advise you to review those guidelines carefully. Our covenants have legal standing, and we take enforcement quite seriously. This, he waved dismissively at my grandfather's cabin, unfortunate eyesore has been tolerated out of respect for your grandfather's age. That tolerance has limits. Without waiting for my response, he returned to his vehicle and drove away, leaving me standing on the half-stained porch, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The following week brought a steady escalation of pressure. Every morning seemed to deliver a new notice of violation in my mailbox, each more absurd than the last. The first claimed my exterior paint color does not conform to approved natural tones palette. Death. Despite the cabin having the same cedar stain for decades. The next complained about unauthorized native plant species growing along my shoreline, essentially wildflowers that had always been there. I watched with growing concern as luxury vehicles drove slowly past my property multiple times daily. The occupants made no attempt to hide their activities as they photographed my cabin and made notes on tablets. One afternoon, a drone hovered over my property for nearly 30 minutes before I waved my arms angrily enough to send it retreating across the lake. The pattern became clear. The HOA was documenting everything they could possibly use against me. When I tried to launch my small fishing boat from what I had always known as the community boat ramp, I found it blocked with a chain and a freshly installed sign reading, "Closed for seasonal maintenance, HOA members only." But this has always been a public access point, I protested to the maintenance worker installing the sign. He shrugged apologetically. "Just following orders from the board, sir. They said only residents with current HOA credentials can use the facilities." The harassment reached new levels when I invited 3 college friends for a weekend visit. We spent the day hiking nearby trails, returning to find bright orange violation stickers plastered across all their car windows. "Unauthorized parking, subject to immediate towing," the stickers read, despite the fact that all vehicles were parked entirely on my property. My friend Michael peeled one off with difficulty. "What is with these people? The adhesive is practically industrial strength." "They are trying to make me as uncomfortable as possible," I explained, feeling both embarrassed and angry. "They want me gone." That evening, we gathered on the dock with a small campfire in a contained fire pit, something my grandfather and I had done hundreds of times before. Within 20 minutes, a county sheriff deputy's vehicle pulled up. "We received a complaint about an illegal burn and excessive noise," the deputy explained, looking uncomfortable about the situation. He glanced at our small, contained fire and the quiet gathering, though I can see the complaint was exaggerated. "This is private property," I stated, "and we are not violating any county regulations." "No, you are not," he agreed quietly, "but I had to respond to the call. Just keep it reasonable, okay? I would hate to have to come back out here." The next morning, my friends departed earlier than planned, all of us frustrated by the constant scrutiny and harassment. As I waved goodbye to their cars, I noticed several wooden stakes with bright orange flags positioned throughout my yard near the water's edge. I approached one, finding "Property Line Survey, Lakeside Estates HOA" printed on the flag. They had entered my property without permission and placed survey markers, apparently attempting to claim portions of my land extended into community property. When I called the HOA office to complain about the trespassing, the receptionist coldly informed me that the board had authorized a routine boundary verification throughout the community. When I insisted this was illegal, she simply stated that I would need to take it up at the next board meeting. "When is that?" I asked. "The schedule is posted for members in good standing on our community website," she replied before hanging up. Frustrated, I called Albert, who had become my only ally in the community. "They are ramping up pressure on you faster than they did with the rest of us," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Harrington must see you as a particular threat for some reason." "Is there any way you can find out when their next meeting is?" I asked. The following day, Albert discreetly delivered a printed copy of recent HOA meeting minutes he had obtained from a sympathetic neighbor who worked in their office. What I read chilled me to the bone. The minutes documented months of discussions about my grandfather's property, referring to it as the final non-conforming holdout and prime lakefront real estate for community expansion. There were detailed plans for extending their clubhouse facilities onto what was clearly my property, contingent on resolution of the ownership situation. Most disturbing was a motion, unanimously approved, to allocate funds for legal measures to incorporate the Martin property into community common areas following actuarial predictions of ownership change. They had been planning to take my property while my grandfather was still alive, anticipating his death as a business opportunity. That night, I stood on the dock watching flashlights sweep across the property line as figures moved in the darkness. They were not even attempting to hide their surveillance anymore. When I aimed my own flashlight in their direction, they simply turned and walked away without acknowledging their intrusion. I went inside and locked the doors, something I had never done at the cabin before. As I lay awake listening to vehicles slowly driving past, I realized this had progressed beyond neighborly disagreement. The HOA was not just being difficult, they were systematically working to force me out through intimidation and harassment. What had begun as annoying interference had evolved into something that felt dangerous and deeply personal. A loud knock at the door jolted me awake. The morning sun streamed through the windows as I pulled on a robe and went to answer it. A courier in uniform stood on my porch holding an electronic signature pad. "Certified letter requiring signature," he stated flatly. I signed and took the thick envelope, noting the return address of Blackwell, Price and Associates, attorneys at law. My stomach tightened as I closed the door and tore open the heavy paper. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter printed on expensive letterhead. The legal language was dense, but the message was unmistakable. I was being ordered to bring my property into full compliance with Lakeside Estates' HOA standards within 30 days or face legal action including substantial daily fines, liens against the property, and court-ordered compliance measures. The letter claimed my property was subject to HOA jurisdiction based on community development statutes and established boundary agreements. It detailed 12 specific violations, from unauthorized exterior appearance to non-compliant shoreline vegetation. The final paragraph threatened that failure to comply would result in immediate legal proceedings. I placed the letter on the kitchen table next to an old black and white photograph of my grandparents standing proudly in front of their newly built cabin in 1968. Their smiling faces contrasted sharply with the cold threats contained in the law firm's letter. With hands trembling between anger and anxiety, I picked up my phone and searched for local attorneys. I found a small firm specializing in property disputes and made an appointment for that afternoon. The law office of Jensen and Moore occupied a modest building in the nearby town. Sarah Jensen, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened carefully as I explained the situation and showed her the cease and desist letter. "These aggressive HOA tactics are unfortunately becoming more common," she said after reviewing the document. "They are counting on intimidating you into either selling or complying without question, but before we respond, I need to see all the documentation related to your property. Deeds, surveys, tax records, anything your grandfather kept." "There is a stack of papers at the cabin," I told her. "I have not gone through them all yet." "That should be your immediate priority," she advised. "Bring everything to me. The original deed and any property surveys are particularly important. We need to establish exactly what your grandfather owned and what rights might have been transferred or encumbered over the years." That evening I spread dozens of documents across the dining table. Many were yellowed with age, some still in their original envelopes from decades past. Tax receipts dating back to the 1960s, insurance policies, utility easements. I organized them chronologically, creating stacks by decade. Near midnight, I found a large envelope containing the original property deed from 1968. It described the boundaries of my grandfather's purchase in detailed legal language, with references to survey markers and natural features. I struggled to visualize the exact boundaries from the technical description. Beneath this was another folder containing what appeared to be survey maps from different periods. The oldest, from when my grandfather purchased the property, showed a much larger parcel than I had imagined. According to this document, his land extended well beyond the cabin area, encompassing significant shoreline and, I squinted at the faded lines, not quite believing what I was seeing. I spread the survey map across the entire table, aligning it with a more recent county plat map I found in another folder. My breath caught as I traced the property lines with my finger. If these documents were accurate, my grandfather's property included not just the cabin and immediate surroundings, but extended across most of the northern lakeshore and included the lake itself. Sleep eluded me as I continued examining document after document, each confirming my growing suspicion. Property tax assessments from the 1970s and 1980s referenced lake and surrounding acreage. Water rights certificates named my grandfather as having primary rights to the lake. A letter from the county dating 1995 addressed him as the primary property owner of Lake Martin and adjacent lands. The next morning, I gathered all the documents into a portfolio and drove straight to Sarah Jensen's office. Her eyes widened as we spread the surveys across her conference table. "Based on these documents," she said slowly, "your grandfather appears to have owned not just the cabin lot, but the entire lake and significant portions of what is now the Lakeside Estates development." "How is that possible?" I asked. "How could they build an entire community on his land?" "That is what we need to find out," she replied, already reaching for her phone. "I am going to request a comprehensive title search and have a professional surveyor verify these boundaries." While we waited for her assistant to connect the call, Sarah drafted a brief response to the HOA's law firm, requesting an extension to respond to their demands while we researched relevant property records. The carefully worded letter revealed nothing of our discovery while buying us time. 2 days later, I received an email from Richard Harrington. The HOA had rejected our request for an extension. The message ended with a thinly veiled threat. "The board has unanimously voted to pursue all legal means necessary to ensure community standards are maintained. We suggest you reconsider your position before significant legal expenses are incurred." They had no idea what we had discovered, or that their aggressive pursuit was about to backfire spectacularly. The law office conference room was transformed into an impromptu research center. Maps and documents covered every available surface as Sarah Jensen, and I worked with a property surveyor and title researcher to piece together the full history of my grandfather's land. "Your grandfather purchased this entire area in 1968, the title researcher explained, pointing to a large map spread across the conference table. "Back then, land was relatively inexpensive, especially in remote areas. He acquired approximately 175 acres, including the entire lake, which is about 45 acres of water surface, and all surrounding shoreline extending roughly a quarter-mile from the water in all directions." The surveyor, an older man named Bill who had worked in the county for decades, nodded in agreement. "These original survey markers match county records. Your property boundaries are exactly as shown in these documents, including the entire lake and most of what is now Lakeside Estates." I stared at the maps in disbelief. But how could a development be built on land my grandfather owned? Surely someone would have checked property records. Sarah pulled out another folder. "That is where it gets interesting. We found these communications between Harrington Development Group and their attorneys from 2013, just before construction began on Lakeside Estates." The documents revealed that Richard Harrington's company had indeed discovered my grandfather's extensive ownership during their initial due diligence. Rather than approaching him directly to purchase the land properly, they had employed a questionable strategy. "They built on a legal technicality," Sarah explained. "Your grandfather had allowed the county to use the lake for public recreation for decades without formal agreements. Harrington's company argued this constituted abandonment of certain property rights and quietly filed for adverse possession of portions of the land." "Adverse possession?" I asked. "It is a legal doctrine that allows someone to claim property rights over land they do not legally own if they use it openly for a statutory period without the owner contesting it. In this case, they filed paperwork claiming parts of the shoreline, but very specifically did not challenge ownership of the lake itself or your cabin area." The surveyor pointed to various points on the map. They carefully avoided directly claiming the core property, focusing instead on creating confusion about the boundaries. They built in phases, starting with areas furthest from your grandfather's cabin, gradually encroaching closer over the years. Sarah continued, "Your grandfather was in his 80s when this started. They likely assumed he would not notice the technical legal maneuvers or have the energy to fight them. The documents show they considered it a calculated risk that would be resolved naturally through time, essentially waiting for him to pass away." The implications were staggering. Through the conference room window, I could see people walking along the main street of the small town, completely unaware of the bombshell we had uncovered. "So what does this mean exactly?" I asked, trying to process the information. Sarah's expression was serious, but I detected a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "It means that the Lakeside Estates community clubhouse, their boat docks, and their main parking lot are all sitting on land that legally belongs to you. While they may have established limited rights to some of the residential areas through adverse possession filings, they never established legal ownership of the core amenities or the lake itself. Their entire luxury lake community is essentially using your private lake without permission," the title researcher added, "and their aggressive actions against you constitute harassment of the actual legal property owner." I sat back in my chair, stunned by the reversal. For weeks, I had been treated as an unwelcome intruder on my own property. Now I discovered that the true trespassers were the very people attempting to force me out. "What should we do with this information?" I asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "We need to be strategic. First, we should gather more evidence of their actions against you. Document everything, the violation notices, the survey stakes they placed without permission, the restricted access to the boat launch. Simultaneously, we will prepare a comprehensive legal response establishing your ownership rights." "Should we tell them immediately?" "Not yet," she advised. "They have shown their hand, they want your property, and are willing to use intimidation to get it. Let us build our case thoroughly before revealing what we know. Right now, they believe they are dealing with an isolated cabin owner unaware of his rights. That misconception gives us an advantage." We spent the rest of the day formulating our strategy. Sarah drafted a response to the HOA's legal threat that revealed nothing about our discovery while firmly disputing their authority over my property. The letter requested all communication go through her office, moving forward, and demanded copies of any documents purporting to grant the HOA jurisdiction over my land. "This response will buy us time while suggesting we are not intimidated," she explained. "It will likely prompt them to escalate, revealing more of their intentions and possibly making additional mistakes we can use to our advantage." As I drove back to the cabin that evening, I saw Lakeside Estates with entirely new eyes. The imposing entrance gate, the manicured common areas, the luxury clubhouse, all of it existed on land that rightfully belonged to my family. The residents walking their dogs along the shoreline path, the children swimming off the community dock, the boats moored at their slips, all were enjoying my property without permission or compensation. I felt a strange mix of anger and responsibility. These people had purchased homes in good faith, unaware of the developer's deception. They were not the primary villains in this story, though many had participated in the campaign to drive me away. The true culprit was Richard Harrington and his company, who had deliberately built on land they knew belonged to someone else. For now, I would keep this knowledge to myself, a quiet storm gathering on the horizon that the HOA could not see coming. A week later, the HOA responded to our letter with an invitation to attend their next board meeting to discuss compliance issues. The tone was coldly professional, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of authority. They clearly expected me to appear alone and be overwhelmed by their collective presence. "This is actually perfect," Sarah said when I called her about the invitation. "They are giving us exactly the forum we need. We will attend together and bring all our documentation." On the night of the meeting, Sarah and I arrived at the Lakeside Estates clubhouse precisely on time. She carried a leather portfolio containing carefully organized evidence of my property ownership. I wore the nicest clothes I had brought to the cabin, not quite matching the board members' expensive attire, but presentable and dignified. The community room buzzed with whispered conversations as we entered. About 20 residents were seated in the audience section, while the 12 HOA board members sat at an elevated table at the front, looking down at the audience area. Richard Harrington occupied the center seat, with Patricia Winters to his right. "We will now address the Martin property compliance issues," Harrington announced after calling the meeting to order. "Mr. Martin, you have requested this opportunity to discuss your response to our notices. You have 10 minutes. "Actually," Sarah interjected, standing and introducing herself as my legal representative, "we requested no such meeting. We were invited by the board to discuss these matters." Harrington's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The presence of my attorney had clearly not been anticipated. "Very well," he said. "The board has documented numerous violations of community standards at your property. We have attempted to work with you informally, but you have refused to acknowledge our authority or comply with our reasonable requirements." He proceeded to list each violation in excruciating detail, his voice echoing through the room as he described my cabin as deteriorating, my landscaping as unkempt, and my presence as disruptive to community harmony. Several board members nodded in agreement as residents in the audience murmured their sup. "Lord." "Furthermore," he continued, "your recent communication through counsel questioning our jurisdiction is both obstructive and contrary to established community governance. The board has voted to pursue immediate legal action to enforce compliance." "If I may respond," Sarah said calmly when he finally paused. Harrington nodded with the confident expression of someone who believes they have already won. Sarah opened her portfolio and removed a large folded document, which she proceeded to spread across the table directly in front of the board. It was the original survey map of my grandfather's property, with property lines clearly marked and dated 1968. "Before we address any alleged violations, we should establish the fundamental question of jurisdiction and ownership," she began. "This certified survey map shows the property purchased by James Martin in 1968. As you can see, his purchase included not only the cabin area, but the entire lake and surrounding shoreline extending approximately a quarter-mile in all directions from the water." She paused to let this information sink in, then placed another map beside the first. "This is a current county survey map with the original property lines overlaid in red. You will notice that the Lakeside Estates clubhouse, boat docks, and main parking lot are all situated entirely within the original boundaries of the Martin property." The room fell completely silent. Richard Harrington leaned forward, his face flushing as he examined the maps. Patricia Winters whispered urgently to another board member. "That is impossible," Harrington finally stated. "The development company purchased this land legally before construction began." "Did they?" Sarah asked, producing another document. "This is the complete title history for the property. At no point did James Martin sell any portion of the original 175 acres to Harrington Development Group or any other entity." "There were adverse possession filings," Harrington countered, his voice losing some of its confidence. "Yes, there were," Sarah acknowledged, "limited to certain peripheral areas of the original property. However, no adverse possession claim was ever filed or approved for the lake itself, the shoreline immediately surrounding it, or the areas currently occupied by community facilities." She produced additional documents one by one, property tax records showing my grandfather's continued payment of taxes on the lake, water rights certificates, county correspondence acknowledging him as the lake owner, and finally, my own deed of inheritance transferring all rights and ownership to me. "In simple terms," Sarah concluded, "my client is the legal owner of Lake Martin and substantial portions of what is now the Lakeside Estates community. Every resident who uses the lake, the clubhouse, or parks in the main lot is doing so on private property without the owner's permission." The silence that followed was absolute. Board members exchanged shocked glances as the implications became clear. Several residents in the audience began whispering urgently to each other. Richard Harrington's face had drained of all color as he frantically examined the documents, searching for any error or loophole. "These documents will need to be verified," he finally stated, his voice noticeably shaken. Of course, Sarah agreed. We have already filed the appropriate paperwork with the county to formally reassert the original property boundaries. A professional survey team will be marking the actual property lines next week. I had remained silent throughout this exchange, watching the dramatic shift in power unfold. Now I spoke for the first time. I did not come here seeking conflict. I simply wanted to live peacefully in my grandfather's cabin, which I now know stands on just a small portion of my actual property. I pulled a document from Sarah's portfolio, a draft agreement we had prepared. Rather than demanding immediate evacuation of facilities built on my land, I am proposing a reasonable arrangement that would allow the community to continue using these areas under specific conditions. The draft agreement outlined terms including formal acknowledgement of my ownership, reasonable annual land use fees for community facilities, guaranteed protection of my cabin from future harassment, and assurance that the natural character of the lakeshore would be preserved. Patricia Winters was the first board member to regain her composure. We will need time to review these documents and consult with our attorneys. Of course, Sarah replied. We understand this is unexpected information. We are prepared to give you 2 weeks to verify our claims and consider our proposed agreement. As we gathered our documents to leave, Richard Harrington remained frozen in his chair, staring at the survey map still spread before him. The other board members huddled together in urgent consultation. The audience members watched. He in stunned silence, many likely wondering what this meant for their expensive lakefront properties. Outside in the my parking lot, I realized with a strange sense of disbelief. Sarah turned to me with a satisfied smile. That went exactly as expected. They will verify the documents and discover everything is legitimate. Then the real negotiations will begin. What happens next? I asked. They will fight it initially, she predicted. They will search desperately for any legal challenge, but ultimately the documentation is ironclad. They built their community on your land, and now they will have to come to terms with that reality. I looked back at the clubhouse where lights still blazed in the meeting room. Through the windows, I could see animated discussions continuing, hands gesturing urgently as the board grappled with their new reality. The power dynamic had been completely reversed, and we all knew it. The morning sun sparkled across the lake as I sat on my newly restored dock, coffee mug in hand. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the HOA meeting, and the transformation in both the property and the community had been remarkable. As Sarah had predicted, the HOA initially scrambled to challenge our claims. They hired their own surveyors and title researchers, all of whom reached the same conclusion. I was indeed the legal owner of the lake and significant portions of their development. The revelation spread quickly through the community, creating a divide between those who wanted to fight me at all costs and others who recognized the need for a reasonable solution. The first resident to approach me directly was a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Thomas, a high school science teacher who had purchased his home 5 years earlier. I had no idea about any of this history, he admitted as we talked on the shoreline path. Most of us bought our homes in